Hey guys, this is a quick tutorial on how to use EQ to your advantage. I guess for the lack of a better term, this could be an EQ playbook, if you will. I'm going to show you a few little tips and tricks. Now, you will not need to use this on every track. As cool as some of these tricks are, you will not need to use these on every track. I'm going to show these to you so that when you hear certain characteristics that will in EQ that you can polish up, make that bucket shinier a little bit, if you will, or even in some cases make it less sheen, make it a little less pretty sometimes for the betterment of the song. These are some tricks that will help you achieve that. Now, please don't try all these tricks at once. As they're intended for, just kind of like a toolbox. You wouldn't use a hammer for everything, and you wouldn't use a screwdriver for everything. So don't attempt to use all of these tricks, even in one mix, okay? So the first trick I'm going to show you, I call it finding the fundamental. Finding the fundamental, okay? Now, a fundamental frequency is basically something on percussive instruments. That's usually what I use this trick on, and that's for like a snare drum that has a certain girth about it that one frequency wants to jump out. I'm going to show you an example of this. Another example would be a tom. A tom has a note that it hits, but typically no matter how hard the drummer hits the note's not going to change that much. Now, where you wouldn't want to use a trick like this is on a fretted instrument, or something like that, where a bass guitar, when he hits a G, or let's just say he hits an A, that's going to be around 220 hertz or 440 hertz or whatever that frequency is. Now, you can boost that and definitely make that note louder. This will work, in some cases for like an acoustic bass, if a note is jumping out, or if a note is not loud enough. I've used this trick on several things, but the example I'm going to show you is how to find it on drums, okay? Because I find this really handy, especially when I'm trying to make the drum beefier. Okay, so let's take all the EQ off of this one. This is from the mix that I sent out like last week. So let's listen to the snare. This is just the snare soloed, okay? Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to find the fundamental frequency, and I'm just going to pull up a basic plugin, which is the EQ37 band. That was easy to see. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to narrow a bandwidth like this. I'll reset all this stuff, but if we boosted the frequency, you can see that looks more like a mountain. And what we're going to try to do is make it look more like the Eiffel Tower by doing this. So this is a very thin or a very narrow Q. And if you were to sweep it like this, it would sound a lot like a wah-wah pedal, like a guitar pedal, the wah-wah. And the higher you go, the more intense it is. So this is exactly how a wah-wah pedal works, okay? What we're going to do is we're going to find the fundamental frequency of the snare drum. We're going to find that pitch that the snare is tuned to, okay? So this is how you would do this. I'm going to reset this really quick to the factory default, just so you can see what I did. So I'm going to boost it and narrow it at the same time, okay? So let's listen to this. Now, we have found the fundamental frequency of the snare drum, and that's 157. Now, you can perceive these as different places. Like if you wanted to, make this sound like a big fat snare and it was a thin snare, you find this frequency and boost it. Now, you wouldn't want to leave it up that high, but here's what we're going to do. We're going to pull it down a little bit, and now that we've found the fundamental frequency, we won't mess with this too much. We'll just mess with this and the gain, okay? Now you see how that adds a little bit of girth to the snare. So you would use this trick when you knew that if the snare didn't have enough tone to it. If you wanted to hear more like the big body, because right now the trend is to have big fat snares, and this is how you find the fatness of a snare without feeling like you're just shooting in the dark. like you don't know what you're going for. If you boost a very narrow bandwidth, you can find this fundamental frequency. Now, just a couple of warnings here. When you do something like this, typically you will kind of unbalance the sound. So you probably need to find a frequency that you could boost up here to make it brighter. So I'll show you another trick like that in just a minute. So that's what I call finding the fundamental. And just for fun, let's do this. And by the way, while I'm looking for this other tom here, what you're going to find is a little bit of that goes a long way. If you tend to do that too much, your drums are going to sound a little bit odd if you do that too much. Okay, so here's another example of finding the fundamental on the tom. Okay, so let's go to the tom. Let's do the same thing. I'm just going to grab a basic EQ 7-band, and we're going to find that sound that the tom likes to hear. Now, not all toms need this. Some do, though. Doom. You hear that? Now, if you wanted to bring that out, let's find it. Now, you may not need to do anything with it, but I just want to find it, and I want you to get good at finding it, okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just solo this part of the toms. Just so we can, a lot of times if you solo a small part of it, it'll help you to find it a little faster. You hear that? We just found the fundamental frequency of this tom. So if you wanted a little more girth, you would know exactly where to find it now. Okay, so we just narrow this out a little bit. And you hear how the tone just comes to life on that? Okay, so that's called finding the fundamental. It's hard to say, easy to do though, now that you know, okay? Okay, so the next trick I'm going to show you is called killing the ring. Okay, and it's almost the opposite of this. So we're going to go back to the snare, and sometimes you get a snare that's just a little ringy. It has a ring in it. Sometimes they're desirable, sometimes they're not desirable. Go to grid so I can grab this measure here. Okay, so I'm gonna just take this snare and the EQ on the snare, and I'm just gonna make it plain again. This is just factory default. Now I want you to notice what we hear on the snare. You hear that? That's a fundamental frequency that we want to do, and we approach it the same way. We find that frequency that's bothering us, which, granted, it's not really bothering us on this snare. There are some snares that you'll hear that just have a very pronounced ring in it. Sometimes a tom has a very pronounced ring in it, but it's not the fundamental of the tom. Okay, sometimes a poorly tuned tom will have a ring in it that's kind of actually making everything muddy. This is how you would find that. First of all, you would find that fundamental frequency again, okay? And it doesn't matter which band you do it in, as long as you can go down far enough. Like this band only goes down to that, 125, and it only goes up to this. So just kind of find something in the range that you're trying to find. I know that we can find it on this on the yellow one here. So let's listen to this snare, okay? So I'm going to pull it down. I've already got the bandwidth narrowed. And also I'm going to do the same thing I just showed you on this. I'm going to grab one beat of it so that we can just narrow in. And for some reason it's not repeating. Sometimes if it's not a big enough gap or piece that you're wanting to hear over and over again, it won't loop. Otherwise you'd get something very machine gun sounding. You hear that? Okay, so now we found it. Now all we have to do, I'm just going to bring it back to 0. Now we know it's at 212.3, and we've got a very narrow bandwidth, so now we should be able to pull that ring all the way out. Hear the ring disappearing? Now if we were to take the, I forget where the fundamental frequency is here, but if you were to take these two together, you could really change the sound of your snare. So I'm going to bypass this for now, and we'll listen to the fundamental again. Okay, so I'm just going to take this out, turn this back on, and if you'll notice, they're really close together, right? So I'm going to boost this and take this down, and usually what you'll notice is that they're within an octave of each other, 167 and 212. A lot of times, in order for someone to get a good sound out of a snare, they cause a ring somewhere else. So this is, this is pretty drastic EQing, but what I'm going to show you is this. Now that we have a ring picked out, this frequency here, and then we have the fundamental frequency picked out here. That's difficult to say. What I'm going to do is show you how you can shape the sound of a snare with doing both things. So as you can tell, when it's not bypassed, you've got a more significant sounding snare, right? So we found the fundamental frequency, and we have done this thing that I called killing the ring, or I call it seek and destroy. Basically, anytime you narrow the bandwidth and you look for that frequency that's bothering you, and this could be in a vocal, it could be anything, but it's easier to tell in drums. I call it seek and destroy. So this is basically this is fundamental. I'm sorry, not fundamental. You're finding the fundamental both times, but one way you're boosting it and you're bringing it out, or bringing it up, and another way you're finding that frequency that's bothering you and you're pulling it down. It's two ways to do the same thing, okay? Okay, so now I want to show you one other trick, and I'm going to call it adding air. And basically, when you EQ something, you find you would find the frequency that you would like. Now see, this is finding the fundamental, except you don't have such a narrow bandwidth, because it would sound a little funny. And it's a little distracting, to tell you the truth, because you start to hear the wah-wah effect. So typically what I'll do on this sort of thing is I'll just leave it at a normal bandwidth, like an octave. Okay, so around 5 or 6K, that's typically where snare drums like it. So what we've done, 3 things on this snare drum. We boosted a fundamental frequency. We've killed a ring there, which, is optional. I'll admit it's optional. You don't have to do it. And you don't want to kill the ring on every snare, because that's what gives a snare personality. Otherwise, you're going to come out with a real dead-sounding drum kit, because the rings they make it cool sometimes. So here's bypassed. One sounds a little bit more girthy, a little bit more proud. The other one's a little bit more anemic, a little bit more ringy, and a little less top end. And you can see I've done three little things to it here. Okay, so we found fundamental frequency here. We've also done it in a less extent here, whereas we did it with a wider bandwidth, or the Q, as another word it's known by. And then another thing that you can do is you can actually do it's what we call adding air. Now this is just adding top end. I'm going to show you the adding air part, okay? Okay, so let's pull this out just a little bit. Let's pull it down, and I want to show you how when you're EQing a snare, you don't have to be in the range of what you're hearing. Like 10K, a lot of people can't hear at 10K, but you can perceive at 10K. Listen. Now see, that's 12 dB at 7K, so we can pull that down a little bit. Now what this actually is doing is it's not adding 7K, it's really starting around 7K, okay? And when it gets up to around 7 to 10K, it's boosting right now 5 dB. But what this is doing is it's boosting the harmonics. Okay, I told you that this would be between an octave. The octaves happen a little slower here, so between 10 and 20K there's a lot of space there, And as a lot of people can't hear that high, especially guys who are a little older maybe, or maybe your crowd's a little older, or maybe your converters are not as good. You can't really hear these frequencies. But what it does is it excites the octave above the frequency you're trying to boost. And this is kind of what's called adding air to something, because you're not actually EQing the frequency that you're wanting to hear. You're actually EQing the octave of the frequency that you want to hear. So let's just say, for example, this is at 5.19. So let's just say we took this and did 10K. Let's do 10K here. And let's do a shelf at 10K, okay? So let's see which gets us more. One's going to be a little more apparent. The other one's going to be more of just a more open sound, okay? So let's add, just to start off, let's add 5 dB of this. I'm not even guaranteeing that I'm going to be able to hear this. And then let's add a 5 dB here. And we'll just go between those, okay? Okay, let's add a little bit more to this. Okay, this is still the best way to do it. This adding air usually works better on vocals, because again, where we are boosting frequencies here that could, in a fretted instrument or a tonal instrument, one that moves pitch, if you boost this frequency, then when they sing this note, that note is going to be, loud, and this note is going to be non-existent. So what you want to do is, when you add EQ to the octave, you're not going to be adding to a note here. You're going to be adding to a frequency. So as you can tell, this does make a difference. Listen. It's subtle, but it opens it up a good bit. And as you can pull this down and it would make even more difference. Now let's listen to the difference. So that's called adding air, and as you can tell, it makes a good difference, but it's a little more subtle, and you use it a little less often. Typically, when I'm adding air to something, I'll actually add that to a group of things. Like if I've got a drum kit that's just a little bit dull sounding, and I want to add a little bit more high end, but I don't want to EQ, in the range that would be where the stick would hit the toms and make the attack sound. I don't want to affect that, but I just want to add a little bit more ambience to it, or a little bit more air, a little bit a more open sound. I might add this trick here to the mix. Now let me show you an EQ that I use a lot that has this on there. It's called the Moog EQ4. If you'll notice about this Moog EQ4 is it has an air gain. And if you notice, the air band starts at 2.5 and goes all the way up to 40. Now listen to the difference this makes in the air band. Okay, so that's one of the ones I use. It's called the Moog EQ4, and it's really great. And I usually put this across buses. For instance, I don't know if I used it on this one or not. Let's just see if I used it on the tracks. I did not use it on the tracks. I may have used it on the mix. I did not use it on the mix either. It looks like I didn't use it on this particular mix at all. But typically when you're adding air band frequencies, that's where you add it. You add it, find something that's pretty cool like that. Okay, so let me show you another trick. That's called adding air. This one's called cleaning the mud. Okay, so let's listen to the lead vocal just for a second, okay?
I felt the chill of the winter wind as the snow comes blowing in. When it's cold as cold could be, and I can't. Kinda cold that says you ain't coming back.
Okay, there is a buildup, slight. It's very slight, and bear with me now because this is not an obvious example, but there's a slight buildup. Let me make sure I didn't add it.
The kinda cold that says you ain't coming back.
Okay, so if you would tend to add high end to a vocal like this, let me encourage you to first try this. Okay, I'm just going to do this with. Let me do it with the same thing, just so you'll be familiar with how we get around on these tools. Okay, this would be the same thing. Now this would be when you tend to want to add low end and top end at the same time. Basically, let me show you. Just let me show you real quick. Okay, so let's just say you wanted to add low end here, and then let's say you wanted to add top end here. Okay, well look what you're doing here. If you were to pull these down, and instead of these being 60 dB above 0, let's just say we did this. Let's set this one here and this one here, but we took this and instead made the bandwidth broader. When you're doing this, that's the effective same result. You've got the same shape EQ, right? It's starting here and then it goes down and it peaks down around 500 and then it goes back up again. It's the same curve. The only difference is this one you're cutting, the other one you're boosting a lot. So finding this frequency would be invaluable, right? Because now you're not adding to the gain stage. You're not possibly distorting things because you're boosting frequencies that that you don't necessarily need. You're just wanting to hear a different balance of frequencies. And really, if you think about it, EQ is really just smart fader control, right? You're breaking the frequencies down into different volume knobs, and that's what you're doing here. Is you're taking the volume of a certain frequency and you're pulling it down. I heard my friend Graham talk about this one time, and it made a lot of sense. I don't know where he heard it, but it's a very very cool way to think about it. So now let's find that frequency where you would find that. Basically we're going to be doing the same thing where we find the fundamental again. Okay, so let's do this.
The kind of cold that says you ain't coming back. The kind of cold that says you ain't coming back. The kind of cold that says you ain't coming back. The kind of cold that says you ain't coming back. The kind of cold that says you ain't coming back.
Now you hear right there, I've narrowed the bandwidth, and by the way, I did that by holding on the Mac, holding Control. There on PC, there's another button that does this too, and you drag it left to right. That's how you can widen or narrow the bandwidth. So when we narrowed the bandwidth, it became more obvious, right? Listen.
The kind of cold that says you ain't coming back. The kind of cold that says you ain't coming back. The kind of cold that says you ain't coming back.
That frequency right there. Now you have to look for it. I mean, it's not always obvious, but right there, we've got it boosted up, and that's where he starts to sound a little bit covered, like he's singing into a cardboard box or something. So now we know where to cut, right? So we're going to just broaden this just a little bit, and now when we listen,
the kind of cold that says you ain't coming back. The kind of cold that says you ain't coming back. The kind of cold that says you ain't coming back. The kind of cold that says you ain't coming back.
So that frequency pulled out some of the muddiness, and it might have. Keep in mind that we've pulled this volume knob down, so the net result is a little lower. So let's look at the input versus the output, okay?
The kind of cold that's...
If you can see, when this one's up at 6, this one's up back down here around -7 or 8. So we can boost the output now because we've cut this frequency, and overall we want the volume to be the same, right?
The kind of cold that says you ain't coming back. The kind of cold that says you ain't coming back. The kind of cold that says you ain't coming back. The kind of cold that says you ain't coming back.
One is just slightly cleaner, right? I think you would agree with me that when it's not bypassed, when we're pulling this frequency out, even 3 dB may be a little bit much, but I wanted to show you, for example, when you hear people talking about cleaning up the mud and, taking the mud out of something, this is how they're doing it. And they're not just guessing at it. At least I don't just guess at it. I find that frequency. When I say it's muddy, I usually hear the frequency in my head. There's a pitch, there's a note in my head or a range, and this is how you find it. You do the seek and destroy thing again. You boost it up in a narrow bandwidth, and you find that annoying frequency. Now, you can do this in a live setting or in a studio setting. You boost that frequency, and then you pull it back down, and then you approach what you really want to do with it. And in this case, it was like pull it out just a little bit. So if we listen to it now with it not quite as done, that's half the EQ. Listen to the difference.
The kind of cold that says you ain't coming back. The kind of cold that says you ain't coming back.
Now that is subtle. I'll admit that is very subtle. But what we can do too is we can also add the air, right? So let's just for kicks, let's add the air to his vocal.
The kind of cold that says you ain't coming back. The kind of cold that says you ain't coming back.
Sorry.
The kind of cold that says you ain't coming back. The kind of cold that says you ain't coming back. The kind of cold that says you ain't coming back. The kind of cold that says you ain't coming back. The kind of cold that says you ain't coming back. The kind.
Okay, now let's listen to before and after.
The kind of cold that says you ain't coming back. The kind of cold that says you ain't coming back.
One, it's just a little bit more in your face. Now, this is just to show you. I would probably in this case not do this. I would probably find this frequency, not the shelf. Now, by definition, a shelf adds. Remember, it adds an equal amount. When we put it up here, it adds an equal amount of the frequency no matter where you're going. So basically without, with the little Zorro curve there, it's basically adding the same amount after that. I'll show you a little trick you can do with that too in just a minute. But this, this adds, if you go wide with the bandwidth, you can't hear it as much. Remember, when you go narrow, it sounds more like a wah.
The kind of cold that says you ain't coming back.
Now you can hear that me messing with the frequencies there, but when you go wide with it and be a little bit more subtle, then you're getting a little bit more.
The kind of cold that says you ain't coming back. The kind of cold that says you ain't coming back. The kind of cold that says you ain't coming back.
Right? Okay, so that's probably something what I would do there. That's very subtle EQ. Very subtle EQ, but you do this to, 24 channels, and your subtle EQ now turns into something that's very, very big. So just keep that in mind, okay? Let me show you one other thing that that's pretty handy. As you know, you can do a filter, and that's the first thing I would do to this vocal. To be honest with you, I would turn the filter on, and I would go as drastic as possible first. 24 dB per octave is basically a drop off, and then when you listen.
The kind of cold that says you ain't coming back. The kind of cold that says you ain't coming back. The kind of cold that says you ain't coming back.
Now see, we haven't made a lot of difference in there, but look how much we've chopped off. And we can go a little bit more subtle with that too. Listen.
The kind of cold that says you ain't coming back. The kind of cold that says you ain't coming back. The kind of cold that says you ain't coming back. The kind of cold that's...
Now, I'm not listening to this on speakers with subs on it right now, but I'll bet you that if you were listening with big, hefty subs, you could hear that difference right there. And those little differences make all the difference in the world. It's not just one thing you do as a mixer. It's 100 little things, remember? So these are little things we're doing here. Okay? Let me show you one last trick, and this is the shelf and filter trick, okay? So now we've got a filter done right here, right? But if you didn't like the way, this is what I do sometimes. Like, see, I've got this red one here, and it's doing nothing. Sometimes I'll put a big shelf on the red one, and if you look, when you push this, you're getting this little bump right before it filters out, okay? Because here's the shelf here, right? The red part, see that? That's the shelf that we're getting, and then here's the filter. So basically they're working together. And let's be a little bit more drastic on this. And let's see, this would work better on a kick drum. So let's do this on the kick drum, okay? Let's do the shelf and filter trick on the kick drum. This is the last one I'll show you here. I'm just going to grab this. Okay, so I'm going to take these out and I'm going to show you the shelf and filter trick. Again, we'll use the same EQ. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to filter this first, okay? I'm going to turn it on, and then we'll go. Okay, so now we've filtered it out. I'm going to be kind of halfway progressive about it. And then I'm going to find a frequency here, and you can do either one. If you want to be a little bit more accurate, you can probably do this. What we're trying to do though is we're trying to grab one last hurrah on the low end before we filter it out. And so we're trying to get the most impact out of the low end right before we cut it out. So it's as clean as it can be before this, okay? So let's take a listen to this. Okay, so we've got a little bump right here at 50 hertz, which is not untypical, but everything under that is dumped. Okay, we've got everything out of that, so it's kind of like a shelf and a filter. Or we can do shelf here. Let's see, shelf, and you can see that it actually cuts. It ends up cutting a little bit with the shelf, and then it bumps, and then it filters out. Okay, so you get, if you've got a little mud and it's right here, but you want to boost right here. Remember, I was telling you that most of the time when you find a frequency and you boost it, usually the mud or the ring, the thing that you don't like, happens within an octave. This is actually getting both of those things at once, okay? So let's check it out. Now, if you'll notice, if you were to take an old desirable Neve EQ or even an SSL, if you were to look at the frequencies, the way, and even a Pultec EQ, like a tube EQ, old school, if you do any research at all, you'll notice that these are the kinds of vintage curves. As a matter of fact, let me pull this up and show you kind of what Isotope does. Isotope, now this is a beloved plugin of mine. Isotope, Ozone, let's use 6. Because I believe that 6 has this thing called like a vintage curve. Give it a second. It's a hog. Okay, so I haven't used this one in a while. Perhaps I should have pulled up Isotope 5. Anyway, just bear with me as I do this. You can actually boost frequencies here, and you know what? Yeah, here we go. Vintage, the vintage curve here. Sorry, shelf. Let's go shelf, because this tends to happen on the shelf. If you notice the 1073 EQs, those old desirable EQs, they have this thing where, when you boost them and you narrow the bandwidth, you see how it's ducking this below the actual bandwidth. Let me find a. Sorry, I hate to go about this in a weird way, but I'm not used to this one. So suffice it to say that when you do this vintage thing here, if you notice, look, as I go to the left, you see how it's actually cutting before it boosts down here. This is kind of the magic sauce that a lot of the vintage EQs have that the other ones don't. As you narrow this, you can see just what it does, and the more you boost, the more it cuts. This is kind of a same thing. You get that when you cut it, a vintage shelf, you notice it has a little bump. SSLs do this, Pultecs do this, and Neves do this. And this is just a trick that they do that you can emulate with just about any any EQ. Okay, so we covered several things. We found fundamental. That is the most important thing. That's how you boost the gain, you narrow the bandwidth, and then you experiment with the frequency until you find that annoying frequency. And then the next few things that you would do depend on the tricks that you want to do. If you want to find the fundamental, if you want to bring out a tone of a snare, then you boost it. If you want to kill the ring on a snare or a tom that's not helping you at all, then you cut it. Basically, you're seeking and destroying that frequency that you like, or you're boosting that frequency that you like. You can also add air to a frequency by adding above where the frequency is that you would normally boost. You can do that to add air. You typically would do that on groups, and then you can do the shelf and filter trick, where the vintage shelf trick, where they actually boost a small little amount or cut a small amount, and you basically are getting two of these EQ playbooks or plays in the same thing by using a vintage style EQ approach. Okay. If I've said anything in here that confuses you, be sure that you reach out and ask me questions on it. You can also ask on the next webinar, and hopefully you can use some of these things when you go and mix. You can use, like I said, don't use all these at one time, but you will definitely have a good way to approach it. The most important thing would be to always be listening to that EQ frequency that you don't like or that you do like, and now you know how to find it and move forward. Okay? So thanks for tuning in, and I will see you soon.